In March 2016, 10 miles west of Greencastle, Travis Fisher pulled his 1998 Ford F-150 into the gravel lot beside the Putnam County Extension Office, and people who did not know him made the same mistake they had made for years. The truck had 287,000 miles, rust clear through both rocker panels, a cracked tail light taped in place, and a driver's seat patched with gray duct tape over old canvas. Travis stepped out in faded coveralls stitched at both knees, mud on his boots, and a coat so worn at the cuffs that the lining showed. Across the lot, Derek Sloan from Prairie Meridian Pipeline stood beside a new crew cab 3/4-ton pickup with factory chrome still bright, pressed work shirt, polished boots, and a folder of easement packets clipped in clean blue tabs. Derek looked at Travis once, then looked back at his folder with the expression of a man who believed the easiest signature of the day had just arrived. He even said it later to another landowner near the coffee urn, not quietly enough. Guys with old iron need quick cash. The number in his folder was $218,800 if Travis signed in 30 days. To most people in that room, the money sounded like rescue. To Travis, it sounded like a debt he would pay forever in lost productivity. He had heard the same tone before, just with different uniforms. Salesmen had called him cautious. Bankers had called him under-leveraged. A landlord once called him small-minded because he would not chase one more rented quarter section with borrowed operating money at variable rates. Yet by spring 2016, Travis owned 640 acres, free and clear, rented 420 acres on handshake and written leases mixed together, and carried zero operating debt into planting. His machinery line looked tired on first sight and disciplined on second sight. A 1978 tractor he bought at auction for $9,400, a 1991 combine purchased for $28,000, a grain drill rebuilt twice for less than $1,100 in parts each round, and a planter he kept running with winter labor, salvage yard bearings, and careful calibration. Over the previous 5 years, his repair bills averaged $8,900 annually. A comparable financed machinery package would have put his yearly principal and interest near $96,000 at then-current rates. The visual contrast fooled people. The arithmetic did not. Travis did not arrive at that arithmetic by accident. In 1985, when he was 12, he watched his father stand at a farm auction while a line of machinery sold for less than anyone thought possible. Interest rates had climbed, grain margins had thinned, and one operating note rolled into another until the numbers could not breathe. His father did not rant and did not cry in public. He folded the sales sheet once, put it in his coat, and told Travis in the truck ride home, "Debt is never just money. Debt is timing, and timing does not ask your opinion." That sentence settled into him deeper than any lecture could have. When he started on his own in 1996 with rented ground and an inherited pickup worth maybe $2,000, he wrote one rule on a yellow ledger page and kept it taped above his workbench for 20 years. If cash cannot buy it, discipline must wait. The rule made him slower in the short term and stronger in every downturn. In 1998, he rented 110 acres at $92 per acre and netted $18,600 after all costs and family living. In 2001, he bought his first 80 acres for $124,000, paid $42,000 down, then cleared the remaining balance in 6 years by applying an extra $11,000 to $17,000 annually from crop profits and custom baling income. In 2007, he purchased another 160 acres at $3,050 per acre. total $488,000, with $280,000 cash and a short fixed note. He retired in 40 months. In 2010, he bought a distressed tract of 240 acres at $2,480 per acre when others could not secure terms, total $595,200, and paid cash from reserves built during strong basis years. By 2014, he had the full 640 acres owned and no liens on title. He kept his household expenses narrow by intention: property tax and insurance, $14,700 yearly, utilities $3,600, groceries $6,900, clothing $520, health premiums $8,400, church and local giving $4,000. He did not starve his life. He refused to feed status. He expected the consequences of one signature decision to become plain later in the county hearing room, when the spreadsheets finally entered public record and 5 years of outcomes sat side by side. People around him were not foolish, and that distinction mattered to Travis. Leon Haskins, Brenda Klein, Darrell Poe, and Wyatt Mercer were skilled operators with strong work ethic and families counting on them. Around the coffee shop in town, at seed meetings, and in conversations beside fertilizer tanks, Travis heard a conventional logic repeated. Low monthly payments were manageable, quick liquidity bought breathing room, and scale-protected margins. He watched Leon finance a newer combine package more than once, explaining that harvest speed was worth paying for. He heard Brenda talk about bidding hard on rented acres, so she would not lose ground she had built. Darrell told people inflation would outrun interest expense if they kept moving. Wyatt said variable rate operating lines gave him spring flexibility when timing got tight. Each choice could work in friendly markets. None was morally wrong. But from Travis's side of the ledger, the whole structure looked like it required stable weather, cooperative rates, and no persistent drag on yield. Travis built around the opposite assumption. He expected stress, then priced his life to survive it. Every winter he reviewed each field by pass, not just by season: tillage cost, seed rate, fertilizer timing, tile repairs, fuel burn, labor hours, and delivered basis after trucking. If a piece of equipment required $4,000 in work but could give 5 more seasons, he repaired it. If a shiny replacement required financing and raised fixed overhead by $28,000 a year, he walked away. In February 2015, for example, he attended a consignment sale near Brazil, Indiana, and bought a used field cultivator for $3,200, then spent $740 on sweeps, hoses, and tires. A comparable new unit, priced at $29,800, would have carried payments around $6,900 yearly over 5 years with interest. His version worked straight and level. His soil did not care about paint. By the second week of April 2016, as anhydrous bars started moving across the county, Derek Sloan returned with what he framed as a final courtesy offer. Prairie Meridian wanted a permanent easement across 2.4 acres of Travis's strongest black ground at $42,000 per acre, plus $118,000 in temporary construction damages, total $218,800 if signed inside 30 days. Derek presented refusal as a personality flaw. "Yield loss is minimal," he said. "The money is immediate." 4 neighbors signed in the same week. Leon took $301,000 on 3.1 acres. Brenda took $189,600 on 2.0 acres. Darrell took $412,200 on 4.4 acres. Wyatt took $167,400 on 1.7 acres. The checks looked like acceleration capital, and each of them had practical plans for it: down payments, rented expansion, upgraded machinery, operating cushion. Travis asked for 48 hours and went back to his desk with field maps, 10-year yield records, and a legal pad. He estimated a conservative drag of 18 bushels per acre each year along a 100-foot corridor once compaction, disturbed profile, and recurring tile disruption were included. He used a 10-year corn average of 4.72 per bushel with 2.5% annual price escalation, then added projected repair cycles for tile and surface remediation. The upfront check looked large until the compounded loss horizon came into view. He did not debate values at the coffee shop. He returned Derek's packet unsigned. No speech, no theater. Just one sentence at the bottom of his own copy for his records. Cash now, leakage later, decline. That spring, the county saw a patched coat and a rusted truck and assumed fear. What it was really seeing was calculation. Derek read the unsigned packet in the extension office parking lot, tapped the paper with one manicured finger, and gave Travis a smile that carried more judgment than anger. He kept his voice smooth because two other landowners were within earshot. You are turning down $218,800 over a strip you will barely notice, he said, as if he were explaining weather to a child. Travis stood beside the rusted Ford, one glove tucked in his back pocket, coat zipper half broken, and said only, I notice what compounds. Derek glanced at the truck, at the cracked mirror housing, at the worn knees in Travis's coveralls, and decided silence meant ignorance. He promised the offer would not hold forever, then stepped into his spotless crew cab, where the dealer sticker still clung to the rear glass. By late April 2016, the parking lot talk had already hardened into a county verdict. At the Bainbridge grain elevator, a small knot of farmers stood near the scale house window discussing seed population and pipeline checks, and Travis became the cautionary example by simply walking in. His cap was sweat-faded, his boots resoled twice, and his lunch sat in a reused plastic ice cream tub. One man nodded toward him and said, not cruelly but loudly, some people would rather be right than solvent. Another replied that $218,800 could carry a lot of repairs on tired equipment. They were not villains. They were doing math from the visible facts. Visible facts included a 1991 combine with sunburned paint, a house with peeling clapboard, and a man who still bought fence staples by the box instead of by the pallet. Invisible facts included 640 acres free of liens, 420 rented acres with disciplined margins, 1,060 productive acres run without a seasonal operating note, and a machinery strategy that converted cash flow risk into winter labor. Appearance had won the argument in public. Arithmetic had not yet entered the room. Travis loaded soybean seed, signed his weight slip, and drove straight to a field entrance where he kept a metal clipboard in the truck door pocket. He wrote 3 lines. Proposed easement annual drag, 18 bushels per acre minimum equivalent. Corridor and adjacency effect, 7.6 impacted acres over time on 2.4 legal acres. 10-year gross impact estimate with escalation, $529,000 before remediation cycles. Then he wrote one more line beneath them. If they think you are broke, they will offer speed. If they know you are patient, they must offer truth. His patience had structure behind it, and that structure started with one of the few people who had never mistaken him for desperate. In the autumn of 1997, when Travis had only 140 rented acres and a 2-row planter that skipped every 20th foot, an older farmer named Earl Whitcomb watched him fixing a wobbling gauge wheel in cold rain beside County Road 75. Earl farmed 380 acres and had a reputation for tools organized by shadow outlines on shop walls. He did not give speeches. He asked practical questions. What do you owe on that planter? What do you owe on fuel? What do you owe on rent? Travis answered. Planter, 0. Fuel account, $1,640 due in 30 days. Rent current. Earl nodded and drove away. 2 days later, he came back with a wagon tongue, 2 decent used closing wheels, and a coffee can of bearings. Pay me when you can, he said. No interest. He took $240 from Travis 4 months later and never mentioned the favor again. That interaction became a template. Earl would occasionally stop by with one sentence of advice at exactly the moment a young farmer could still change direction. Never finance depreciation at full retail. Price your downside first. Cash is not pride. Cash is oxygen. He showed Travis old notebooks from the early 1980s with penciled columns that made catastrophe legible. 1981 operating interest 19.4%, machinery note 16.8%, 2 late rains, 1 disease year, then auction posters on 3 roads in 1 month. Earl survived because his debt load was small when rates went vertical. His closest friend did not. Travis absorbed the lesson without drama and translated it into fixed personal rules before he had enough scale to feel important. In 1999, with corn at 2.07 per bushel and everyone talking about volume, Travis faced his first growth temptation. A dealer offered him a newer tractor at $62,000 with 10% down and 7-year financing at 8.2%. Monthly payment $874. Annual debt service $10,488 before insurance and maintenance. Travis instead bought an older unit at auction for $11,700, put 2,460s into tires and hydraulics, and accepted lower road speed for 6 seasons. Difference in first-year cash outflow, $47,840. He placed $30,000 of that difference into a local money market ladder averaging 3.9% and kept the rest for rent flexibility. In plain terms, he traded comfort for optionality. In 2003, when he rented an additional 60 acres at $108 per acre, he funded fertilizer and seed from retained earnings rather than a spring line. Total variable cost $14,220. Harvest net from that block after drying and trucking $28,460. Because he did not owe an operating lender, he could wait 3 extra weeks for basis improvement and picked up 0.19 per bushel on 11,200 bushels, adding 2,128 that covered half his annual property insurance. In 2008, amid volatile inputs, he prepaid only what he could cover in cash and skipped one marginal tract where rent had been bid to $238 per acre. He was called timid at winter meetings. 12 months later, that tract changed hands again when the winning bid could not carry thin margins. By the first week of May 2016, as pipeline survey flags multiplied along township roads, Travis returned to the habits that had built his position long before anyone cared about easements. He ran parts inventories after supper. He rebuilt hydraulic cylinders on a scarred wooden bench instead of replacing assemblies. He tracked fuel burn by field pass and adjusted tillage depth to match residue rather than habit. On paper, this looked old-fashioned. In cash terms, it was precise. That month, he spent $1,340 on used opener assemblies, $420 on chains and sprockets, and $690 on a salvage monitor harness to keep his planter variable rate capable enough for his ground. Equivalent new package quote from a dealership rep who stopped by uninvited was $27,400. Travis thanked him, declined, and went back to calibrating. His household reflected the same philosophy without theater. Annual living budget for 2016 sat at $39,860. Property tax and insurance, $15,100. Utilities, $3,740. Groceries, $7,080. Health premiums, $8,760. Clothing, $480. Vehicle insurance and fuel for personal miles, $2,300. Church and local giving, $2,400. No boat payment. No vacation debt. No subscription stack draining monthly cash. He replaced a failed window unit with another used unit for $140 and installed it himself. The house remained plain. The books remained strong. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how this choice plays out when weather, rates, and ego all collide, stay with this story and follow it to the county hearing room, where the numbers finally speak louder than appearances. Travis did not build those numbers alone, but he built them deliberately. He still kept Earl Whitcomb's penciled note in a drawer, downside first. In June 2016, he added his own expanded version on ledger paper and pinned it near the shop radio. Rule 1, no variable rate operating debt. Rule 2, no machinery purchase unless cash remains equal to 1 full year of crop inputs after payment. Rule 3, every rented acre must clear stress test margins at yield minus 15% and price minus 12% simultaneously. Rule 4, maintain 6 months of household costs separate from farm working capital. Rule 5, when offered a lump sum tied to permanent production risk, model 20 harvests, not 2 tax years. That same week, Derek returned with revised language and polished reassurance. He talked about modern remediation standards, subsoil segregation, compaction relief plans, and one-time inconvenience. Travis listened, took the printed pages, and asked for detailed bonding terms tied to measured yield restoration thresholds. Derek said those terms were not standard. Travis replied that permanent rights should not be priced with temporary assumptions. The conversation ended civilly, but the power balance had started to move. Derek had expected a quick signature from a man in patched clothes. Instead, he had found a disciplined operator who treated every promise as a liability until proven by enforceable numbers. On a humid evening near the end of June, Travis parked the same rusted truck by his machine shed and ran one final check before wheat double crop work. The odometer read 288,413. The paint still peeled on the farmhouse trim. Nothing about the place announced wealth. Yet inside the office drawer lay land maps marked paid, equipment lists marked owned, and reserve accounts built one restrained decision at a time. The county still saw an old pickup and tired coveralls. What it was really looking at was a balance sheet designed to outlast persuasion, weather, and fashion. That night, with the truck ticking as it cooled beside the shed, Travis carried his clipboard into the farmhouse office, pulled a legal pad toward him, and built the next 6 years before they arrived. He started with acres, then yield assumptions, then basis bands, then stress cases. The base farm was 1,060 acres worked, 640 owned, and 420 rented, with a crop split that season of 590 corn and 470 soybeans. He penciled conservative trend yields, 184 bushels corn and 55 bushels soybeans, then cut both by 12% in a second column because he trusted planning under strain more than planning under sunshine. On the expense side, he was exact, not optimistic. Seed, fertilizer, chemistry, fuel, dryings, trucking, crop insurance, cash rent, machinery repairs, family living, property tax, and one line that stayed at zero because he guarded it as fiercely as any line on the page operating interest. Zero. He wrote it darker than the others. By the third week of July 2016, he had locked enough fertilizer and diesel to cap a portion of his 2017 exposure in cash, not because prices were perfect, but because paid inputs turn volatility into inconvenience instead of emergency. That first post-offer harvest closed with gross crop receipts of $812,300, government and insurance proceeds of $28,600, and total cash costs of $676,100, leaving $164,800 net after family living. He sent $90,000 to reserve accounts, $24,000 into short treasury ladders, $18,700 into drainage maintenance, and $9,200 into machinery repairs, then kept the remainder liquid for rent timing. No celebration, no new pickup. Just a stronger cushion. His ledger rhythm sharpened from there. In 2017, corn yields beat his stress case and basis improved after harvest. Net farm income, $186,400, exactly as his year-end line later showed, with interest expense still zero. Repairs ran $8,460, below his 5-year average. He added $110,000 to liquid reserves, $40,000 to staggered treasury notes yielding between 1.9 and 2.3%, and prepaid $31,500 of spring inputs before year-end discounts expired. In 2018, weather and basis narrowed margin, but the structure held. Net income, $73,900, repairs $11,200, insurance premiums $9,140, household living $40,320. He let 2 ego-driven rental opportunities pass when projected margin under his stress test fell below $38 per acre. People call that missed growth. His books called it avoided downside. The year-by-year pages looked almost plain until you read them as survival engineering. 2016, reserves $742,000. 2017, $882,000. 2018, $973,000. 2019 flood year. Net income, $142,300, with delayed planting and ugly prevent plant choices, yet still positive because fixed obligations stayed low and no lender demanded covenants in the wettest week of May. 2020, net income, $211,700, after disciplined basis contracts and patient sales into stronger windows. 2021, net income, $198,600, cash reserves $1.14 million. Over that same run, he replaced no major machine with financed debt, choosing parts and labor instead. Average annual repairs, $8,900, against a dealer-modeled $96,000 annual payment stack for a modern financed line. The spread, $87,100 per year, compounded into optionality he could deploy when neighbors were negotiating from pressure. He still bought equipment, but only where arithmetic made sense. In February 2018, he purchased a used 1999 grain trailer for $12,800 cash, then spent $1,140 on brakes and wiring. A newer equivalent with financing would have required about $9,400 down in monthly payments, near $780 over 7 years. Total cost above $74,000 with interest and insurance. In November 2019, he bought a 60-foot auger for $4,600 and rebuilt the gearbox for $390. In March 2020, he picked up a spare planter monitor and harness package at a retirement sale for $1,950, avoiding a $14,700 dealer retrofit. Every decision looked small by itself. The accumulation was not small. He also managed the farm as two separate businesses, production and household, because blended books hide risk. Household budget in 2019 was $41,070. In 2020, it was $42,220 with higher health premiums. In 2021, it reached $43,180 as utilities and medical costs climbed. He covered those from distributions after harvest, never from operating advances. His 6-month household reserve sat in a separate account and was never touched for fertilizer, rent, machinery, or tax strategy. That separation sounded rigid to people who preferred flexibility. It kept him from borrowing in years when markets punished urgency. Before one autumn balance review, he laid out a plain comparison sheet that captured his whole philosophy in one line of arithmetic. If he accepted an easement check of $218,800 in 2016, but absorbed a modeled long-run gross margin drag and recurring remediation burden, beyond that number, he traded permanent earning power for temporary cash. If he declined and kept productive control intact, he retained annual compounding. That was the crux. Money now versus margin forever. In a county where appearance dominated first impressions, his patched coat hid a man treating time as his largest asset. Let me stop here and ask you something. When a decision pays quickly but weakens your next 20 seasons, do you call that profit or a delayed invoice? Keep that question in front of you, because the next 5 years in Putnam County turned on exactly that trade-off. By January 2018, Leon Haskins had put his easement funds into what looked like prudent modernization. He made a down payment on a $346,000 combine at 6.1% over 7 years. His payment schedule came to about $5,068 per month, $60,816 per year before seasonal repairs and insurance. Leon was not reckless. He harvested fast, marketed carefully, and worked long days. But 2 wet harvests reduced field efficiency, raised drying costs, and pushed grain quality discounts higher. Meanwhile, corridor acres and adjacent strips underperformed enough to matter on thin margins. His annual gross reduction tied to those zones averaged around $17,900 over 2018 through 2020, then climbed as tile issues repeated. By 2021, the combine note that looked manageable in a strong year became the fixed obligation he could not trim. Brenda Klein made her decision from a different pressure point. She had fought hard to hold acreage after her father retired, and the easement check of $189,600 felt like a chance to secure planter precision and compete for higher rent ground. She financed a $214,000 planter at 5.8%, roughly $3,105 monthly, and $37,260 yearly. The machine performed well. The problem came from land competition and rent inflation. She added a rental block where cash rent touched $312 per acre, then lost 190 better acres to a larger bidder the following season, leaving the expensive planter over fewer profitable acres. She was skilled, disciplined, and exhausted, trying to run faster on a narrower margin, while the easement lane repeatedly needed attention after heavy crossing traffic and drainage disruptions. Darrell Poe carried the heaviest burden because he believed scale would outrun cost if he moved first. He stacked land and equipment obligations until total debt reached $1.26 million. with portions that reset above 8% when credit tightened. At a blended 5.2%, annual interest had been painful but survivable. At 8.3%, interest alone jumped by roughly $39,000 a year, and that was before principal. Darrell did what many proud operators do under strain. He worked harder, delayed maintenance, and trusted one better crop year to close the gap. Then compaction and tile setbacks along easement corridors cut into consistency right where he needed stability. Wyatt Mercer leaned on variable rate operating lines because they had always been flexible for him. On paper in 2017, 4.25% looked workable. By 2021, with rate pressure and tighter terms, his borrowing cost approached 9.5%. On an operating balance around $620,000 during peak season, annualized interest burden moved from roughly $26,350 to $58,900 if carried through longer windows. That difference, $32,550, erased much of his machinery repair budget and forced grain sales at weaker basis points. Wyatt was not chasing luxury. He was trying to keep timing intact in a market that punished borrow time. None of these four were caricatures. They were solid farmers in a bad sequence of conditions, and their easement money did not vanish in foolish purchases. It got absorbed by the conventional growth script: newer iron, bigger rent exposure, higher fixed commitments, and the assumption that agronomic disturbance would be modest and temporary. Travis watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with the uneasy recognition of numbers arriving exactly where his legal pad model said they would. By the first week of June 2019, weather turned from inconvenience to structural stress. Repeated heavy rains delayed planting windows across west-central Indiana, and saturated zones along disturbed corridors stayed wetter longer. Prevented planting decisions rose. Replant decisions rose. Drying costs rose in the acres that went in late and came off wet. Then input prices stepped up. Then rate pressure followed. And by 2021, the cost stack looked different from the one everyone underwrote in 2016 and 2017. Travis took the same blows and still stayed upright because his break-even sat lower. On his corn ground, full cost break-even, including rent, overhead, and family draw, averaged near 3.41 per bushel in 2020. For peers with heavier machinery and interest commitments, break-even commonly ranged from 4.25 to 4.80 depending on rent and debt service. That spread decided who could hold grain for basis and who had to move grain at harvest lows to satisfy notes. He also had the rare option of paying problems in cash when they were cheapest. In 2020, he spent $22,400 on targeted tile repair and surface shaping across trouble spots, and wrote the checks immediately. Neighbors, under covenant pressure, postponed similar work because lenders prioritized note coverage first. Through 2020 and into 2021, Derek Sloan kept returning with revised language, each version trying to close the one holdout in a corridor already built around signed parcels. The offer rose, then rose again, ultimately reaching a total package framed near $247,000. Derek was still polished, still certain urgency would eventually win. Travis was still standing in worn coveralls beside the same rusted Ford, now showing 291,000 miles, still asking for enforceable restoration metrics and long-horizon loss modeling. At coffee counters, the jokes returned. At lease renewals, a few landlords favored tenants who promised aggressive expansion. Social pressure remained steady, a quiet tax paid in reputation. 3 days after a late July storm in 2021, Standing water pooled along sections of signed ground, long after adjacent rows could carry equipment. Leon walked one of those stretches with his boots sinking and said very little. Brenda called a tile contractor and got a wait list into autumn. Darrell flagged 3 wet pockets that had not behaved that way before corridor work. Wyatt started documenting drowned-out strips with timestamps because his insurer asked for more proof each year. The numbers that had lived in Travis's notebooks were beginning to appear in other people's fields, and what had looked like philosophy was becoming measurement. Within a week, Travis was walking those wet strips with a tile probe, a notebook, and no audience. Leon met him at one outlet that should have been running clear and steady, but was coughing in pulses. Brenda pointed at a pass where her monitor had dropped 20 bushels in less than 60 feet. Darrell had flagged compaction zones with orange paint. Wyatt had date-stamped photos from 3 storms showing ponding in the same depressions. Travis did not argue from memory. He measured infiltration rates, penetrometer resistance, and outlet flow timing after equal rain events, then matched those notes to yield monitor exports and planting dates. By the second week of September 2021, he paid $27,600 out of pocket to build a record that could survive cross-examination. $9,800 went to an independent agronomy firm for zone-by-zone yield normalization using local weather cells. $6,400 went to tile camera work and mapping. $5,900 funded bulk density testing at multiple depths across affected and control strips. $5,500 covered data cleanup and geospatial overlays suitable for county filing. The reports were not dramatic. They were precise. On adjacent comparable soils, the corridor and shoulder zones were consistently underperforming by 14 to 31 bushels per acre, with the highest penalties in years when spring traffic and prolonged saturation overlapped. Derek still treated the issue as manageable noise. At a pre-hearing meeting in early 2022, he requested a corridor amendment and reduced remediation escrow, arguing that long-term restoration had progressed enough to lower bonding requirements. He arrived with a polished binder and 2 consultants who emphasized industry baselines. Travis arrived with a taped folder, muddy boots, and spreadsheets printed on plain white paper. The visual contrast remained unchanged. The balance of evidence did not. The drainage board hearing room in Greencastle filled faster than usual for a weekday agenda. Landowners stood along the back wall. A few seed reps came out of curiosity. 2 lenders sent analysts. Derek spoke first, confident and measured, and framed his request as administrative efficiency. Then the board chair asked whether any affected operators wanted to submit independent data. Travis stood, handed up 6 copies, and asked to project 1 page at a time. He started with methodology because he knew credibility begins there. Weather-normalized comparisons. Same hybrid families where possible. Same planting windows grouped by delay class. Corridor strips matched to control strips on unaffected portions of each farm with similar soil productivity indices. Then he turned to per-acre gross margin impact, not just yield. Lost bushels multiplied by annual cash prices, minus avoided variable harvest costs, plus recurring remediation, and tile maintenance burden, allocated per impacted acre. 5 years, 4 farms, no rounding for effect. Total gross margin impact, $612,000. The room went quiet when he showed that his 2016 legal pad estimate had missed low, not high. Derek challenged assumptions, then challenged attribution, then challenged timeline. Travis answered each point with field pass notes, invoice dates, tile camera footage, and side-by-side yield maps. When Derek asked whether the losses were truly material at whole farm scale, Travis read the percentages into the microphone. Leon, 7.9% reduction in cumulative gross margin versus control strips over 5 crop years. Brenda, 6.8%, Daryl, 8.6%, Wyatt, 5.4%. Material was not a rhetorical term any longer. It was arithmetic in county records. The wealth reveal came from a procedural question, not a speech. A board member asked whether Travis was prepared to stand behind his proposed recovery structure if the amendment was denied, since he had referenced temporary private support for affected operators while remediation disputes continued. Travis said yes, reached into his folder, and passed forward a letter from First State Ag Bank and 4 cashier checks clipped behind it. The letter verified available liquid funds in his operating reserve and Treasury ladder accounts totaling $2,913,447.12 as of that morning, unpledged and immediately accessible. It also confirmed no secured operating debt. The checks were specific: $250,000 payable to Leon Haskins' recovery account, $195,000 to Brenda Klein Farm rehabilitation account, $275,000 to Daryl Poe stabilization account, $60,000 to Wyatt Mercer working capital reset, total $780,000, 0 interest, repayment tied to verified cash flow thresholds. He did not look around to gauge reaction. He simply placed the checks on the clerk table and sat down. People who had known him for years looked at him as if they were meeting him for the first time. One lender analyst asked quietly whether the bank letter was current day or prior close. The clerk read the timestamp aloud. Current day, 9:14 in the morning. Derek stared at the checks longer than he had stared at any yield map. The man who had once called him the easiest signature in the county had just watched a farmer in patched coveralls commit $780,000 in public with no financing contingency and no publicity language attached. The board denied Prairie Meridian's amendment request, ordered full remediation bonding to remain in place, and entered a finding that independent operator submitted loss modeling was materially consistent with observed field performance. Derek, still professional, acknowledged on record that long-horizon agronomic loss should have carried greater weight in original negotiations. It was not theatrical. It was final. Outside, Leon stood by the courthouse steps and said, "I thought you were stubborn." Travis answered, "I was early." Brenda cried once quickly, then asked about repayment terms. Daryl shook his hand and said he had never needed help, less emotionally and more financially. Wyatt asked whether the smallest check meant he had failed worse than the others. Travis told him no. It meant his fastest fix was interest drag and timing, not asset liquidation. If you are learning something from this point in the story, carry one number with you. Fixed costs do not care about your pride, and borrowed urgency is still borrowed. The pool terms were written in 2 pages and filed with signed acknowledgments. Leon's $250,000 package allocated $180,000 to retire the highest cost portion of his combine note and $70,000 for tile, reconstruction, and controlled traffic remediation on affected lanes. Trigger for repayment. No payments due until his year-end working capital ratio exceeded 1.30 and debt service coverage exceeded 1.20 for 2 consecutive quarters. After trigger, annual payments at $25,000 minimum, still 0 interest. First outcome came fast. By harvest 2023, Leon's annual fixed equipment burden had dropped by $32,400, and he moved from forced spot sales to staggered deliveries that improved average corn price by 0.21 per bushel on 96,000 bushels, adding 20,160 in one marketing year. Brenda's 195,000 package carried 140,000 to restructure planter-related pressure and 55,000 dedicated to drainage correction, headland relief, and 2 seasons of compaction mitigation passes. Her repayment trigger was stricter on rent discipline. No repayments until she reduced high rent exposure below 35% of total operated acres and posted positive net farm income after family draw for 1 full year. She cut unworkable leases, kept her best 310-acre core, and ended 2023 with a 64,700 operating surplus before principal reductions, the first clean breathing room she had seen in several seasons. Darrell needed the hardest medicine and the clearest sequence. His $275,000 was split $210,000 for immediate principal reduction on variable reset obligations and $65,000 for targeted field recovery and deferred maintenance that could not wait. Repayment trigger: none until he sold 1 over-leveraged tract and documented a lower blended rate structure. He did the sale in stages, avoided a distressed auction, and used proceeds plus Travis's bridge support to move from a blended 8.3% cost of debt down to 5.6% within 18 months. On $1.26 million of remaining obligations, that rate shift alone lowered annual interest burden by roughly $34,020 before any principal effects. Wyatt's $60,000 looked small beside the others, but it was designed for speed. $40,000 retired the most punitive segment of his variable rate operating line. $20,000 restored input timing so he could stop buying late at worse terms. Trigger: automatic sweep of 15% of any year-end operating surplus above a $75,000 working capital floor. He met that threshold in 2 crop cycles, and his interest expense, which had threatened to run near $58,900 in bad carry periods, settled back under $31,000 with better timing and lower reliance on revolving credit. Travis required 1 non-financial covenant from all 4. Each recipient had to bring complete field-level records to 2 winter review sessions per year, open books included, and each had to mentor 1 younger producer on debt structure once stabilized. He was not building gratitude, he was building transmission. The deeper examination came that first winter after the hearing, when he laid all 5 operations into 1 comparative ledger to test whether the intervention actually changed trajectories or merely delayed pain. He used 5 columns per farm: gross revenue, variable cost, fixed cost including interest, remediation and repair, and ending working capital. Then he ran 2 scenarios from 2022 forward. Scenario A assumed no private recovery pool, continued high-cost debt service, and delayed field correction. Scenario B used the zero-interest pool, immediate targeted remediation, and covenant-based cost discipline. The aggregate difference across Leon, Brenda, Darrell, and Wyatt over the first 3 projected years was $1,184,000 in preserved or recovered gross margin after costs. Of that, $612,000 traced directly to quantified easement-related underperformance already documented over the prior 5 years, and $572,000 came from secondary effects: lower interest drag, better marketing flexibility, fewer emergency repairs, and fewer forced acreage decisions made under cash pressure. The model was conservative. It excluded any upside from unusually strong commodity rallies and counted only outcomes tied to documented changes. He also ran his own books through the same stress lens so no one could claim selective rigor. 2022 net farm income after his $27,600 analysis expense and the $780,000 deployment classified as receivables rather than expense closed at $176,900. Liquid reserves moved from $2.913 million to $2.041 million after disbursement and normal operations. Land remained debt-free. At county average comparable values then in force, his 1,460 owned acres carried estimated market value near $8.19 million. Add liquid reserves, subtract routine payables, and his net worth sat just above $9.9 million, even after funding the recovery pool. The patched coat had not changed. The numbers had simply become public enough that no one could pretend not to see them. By March 2023, repayment had not yet begun for any recipient, exactly as designed, but distress signals had narrowed. No new foreclosure filings among the four, no emergency machinery liquidations, no unpaid spring input invoices beyond normal terms. Travis considered that the first proof point. Survival first, margin second, pride last. Derek's resolution started quietly. Prairie Meridian reassigned him out of active right-of-way negotiations in the district after the hearing record circulated internally. Months later, at a regional farm forum, he told a room of newer agents that upfront checks without long-horizon agronomic loss modeling were negotiation theater, not durable agreements. He did not mention Travis by name. He did not need to. On a cold evening after one of the winter review sessions, Travis drove home in the same 1998 Ford. Odometer pushing past 293,000, heater fan squealing on high, mud still on the floorboard. He parked beside the shed, carried in a stack of ledgers, and added one line under the year-end totals. Appearance is a costume, cash flow is character. He left the ledgers open on the kitchen table, set a mug beside them, and began drafting the spring review calendar before he took off his coat. The recovery pool had done its first job, which was to stop panic, but he wanted proof of second-order results before he called it successful. By the end of that week, each borrower had delivered full records for 2022 closeout and 2023 planning, exactly as the covenant required, and the pattern was already visible in the numbers. Leon went first because his balance sheet had been closest to a forced sale line. After the $180,000 principal reduction from Travis and the $70,000 tile and traffic lane repair allocation, his 2023 fixed equipment burden fell from $94,200 to $61,800. His combine note was not fully gone yet, but the highest cost segment was gone, and that changed his marketing behavior immediately. He no longer dumped corn at harvest lows to satisfy monthly pressure. On 2023 corn volume of 101,400 bushels, his weighted average sale price improved by 0.24 per bushel over his 2019 through 2021 pattern, adding $24,336 in gross revenue without planting one extra acre. Tile work on the corridor-adjacent ground improved infiltration enough that prevented plant acres dropped from 19 to 4 in a similar rain profile year. By January 2024, he hit both covenants, working capital ratio above 1.30 and debt service coverage above 1.20 for 2 consecutive quarters. So repayment began at $25,000 that year. He paid $30,000 instead. Quietly. Brenda's recovery ran through acreage discipline more than machinery. She had already cut high rent exposure, but 2023 was the first full season where her operated footprint matched her strongest margin zones instead of her pride zones. With the 140,000 pressure relief and 55,000 drainage and compaction allocation in place, she reset to a 310-acre core and refused 2 lease offers above her stress test ceiling. Her planter utilization fell in raw acres, but per-acre profitability rose. Her 2023 book showed 64,700 operating surplus before principal. Then 2024 moved to 92,300 as field consistency improved and emergency repair calls dropped by more than half. She hit her repayment trigger in late 2024 and started with 18,000. In 2025, she paid 26,000. She also became the strictest mentor in Travis's review room, telling younger operators one sentence she had learned the hard way: a good machine on bad rent is still bad math. Daryl's path remained the hardest because his debt stack had been layered over years, not one season. The 210,000 principal reduction and 65,000 field recovery money gave him room to execute an orderly tract sale instead of an auction under pressure. In August 2023, he sold the over-leveraged parcel at $8,900 per acre, below peak hopes, but well above distress estimates, and used proceeds to retire variable reset segments first. By spring 2024, his blended cost of debt moved from 8.3% down to 5.6%, then down again to 5.1% after refinance terms improved, with cleaner coverage ratios. Annual interest drag fell by more than $40,000 compared with the pre-intervention trajectory. He did not become suddenly expansive. He became stable. In the 2025 winter session, he told Travis he had slept through a thunderstorm for the first time in 3 years because he no longer heard interest compounding in his head every time rain delayed fieldwork. Wyatt's 60,000 tranche looked modest on paper and powerful in timing, retiring the most punitive 40,000 segment of his variable line and restoring 20,000 in input timing flexibility cut his seasonal borrowing peaks enough that lenders stopped repricing him as a late-risk borrower. In 2023, his peak operating line draw fell from roughly $620,000 to $472,000. Interest expense settled under $31,000, where it had once threatened the high 50s in bad carry periods. He crossed the $75,000 working capital floor in 2024, and automatic surplus sweeps began, first $11,250, then $15,900 in 2025. He closed 2025 with positive working capital for the second consecutive crop cycle and no emergency grain sales. By the first week of December 2024, the multiplier effect Travis had intended was no longer theoretical. The 4 recipients had avoided bankruptcy filings, avoided forced machinery liquidation, and restored enough breathing room to mentor newer operators as required. Those mentees were not handed cash. They were handed process. 2 winter sessions each year, open books, stress test modeling with yield minus 15% and price minus 12%. Across 8 beginning producers who completed 2 seasons under that structure, average operating interest expense fell 22.4% versus their baseline plans, and 6 shifted at least one major purchase from financed retail to cash-used equipment. That did not look glamorous. It looked durable. The direct pool arithmetic by January 2026 was plain. Original disbursement, $780,000. Cumulative repayments received $286,150. Outstanding principal, $493,850. All current under covenant schedules. 0 interest by design. Secondary outcome arithmetic was larger. The 4 farms together, preserved or rebuilt, an estimated $1,463,000 in gross margin relative to the no-intervention path over 2022 through 2025, based on realized books rather than projections. Travis filed that analysis with anonymized line item exhibits for training use through the Extension Office archive so the argument would survive memory and personality. Derek's own line in the story kept narrowing and clarifying. He had already been moved out of active right-of-way negotiations. But in 2024, Prairie Meridian placed him in an internal compliance role, reviewing pre-offer valuation models and remediation assumptions before county filings. It was not a public demotion speech. It was a job change with a message. At the 2025 Regional Farm Forum in Terre Haute, he appeared on a panel about infrastructure conflict and conceded, in precise language, that short-horizon compensation models had underestimated multi-year agronomic drag on disturbed corridors in several counties, including Putnam. He still dressed the same, still spoke smoothly, still preferred polished binders, but his recommendations had changed. He told younger agents to commission third-party soil and drainage impact modeling before quoting price, then to price downside restoration into bonding from day one instead of negotiating it after complaints. After the panel, he crossed the hall, found Travis near a coffee urn, and stood there for a second before speaking. He said, "You were materially right sooner than the rest of us." Travis nodded once and said, "Model 20, harvest next time?" They shook hands. No crowd gathered. No scorekeeping followed. Derek remained with Prairie Meridian through 2026, no longer closing easement signatures, now reviewing risk language that once would have passed unchecked. In county records, that counted as resolution. By March 2026, every named ledger line had an outcome attached. Leon was still farming, now 420 acres, with his combine note retired and a fixed refinance at 4.9% on remaining term debt. Brenda was still farming her profitable 310-acre core, current on every obligation, and had built a $143,000 cash reserve she called her no-panic account. Darrow was still farming with a smaller footprint and stronger ratios. One tract sold, no bankruptcy, repayment current. Wyatt was still farming, off variable rate dependence, with 2 positive working capital years and tighter seasonal borrowing discipline. Earl Whitcomb had passed away in 2024 at 87, and at his funeral, Travis stood at the back, then quietly gave Earl's daughter a sealed envelope containing copies of the old notebooks Earl had once shared and a cashier check for $48,000 to endow a local equipment repair scholarship in Earl's name. Pay me when you can had become pay it forward with structure. The county also learned what had been hidden in plain sight. Spring 2026 filings showed Travis at 1,460 owned acres, all debt-free, with $3.8 million in liquid reserves spread across treasury ladders, insured sweep accounts, and short municipal holdings. At prevailing comparable values, his total net worth was estimated near $11.2 million after accounting for payables and outstanding recovery pool receivables. He still lived in the same 2-bedroom farmhouse, though the peeling paint was finally replaced after Brenda and Leon showed up one Saturday with ladders and refused to leave until the trim was done. He still wore patched coats in the shop. He still drove the same 1998 Ford F-150, odometer past 300,000. Rust unchanged on the rocker panels, engine still steady because he serviced it on schedule. In July 2026, he formalized what he had already been doing informally. The Fisher Soil and Debt-Free Transition Fund was filed with a $2.5 million initial endowment. Its charter allowed three tools only: drainage rehabilitation grants tied to measured yield recovery, beginner equipment purchases capped at used market valuations, and mandatory financial coaching with field-level record review. No vanity buildings, no gala dinners, no unrestricted checks. In its first cycle, the fund approved $412,000 across 11 applicants, each with covenants modeled from the same framework that had carried Leon, Brenda, Darrell, and Wyatt back from pressure. The Extension Office agreed to publish annual outcome tables so performance stayed transparent. If you have followed this story to this point, subscribe for more case studies where arithmetic, not appearance, decides who lasts. Then leave a comment with one number you now track differently on your own balance sheet. Whether it is interest cost, break-even per bushel, or working capital floor. Share this with one producer you know who looks stretched by shiny payments and shrinking options, because one disciplined conversation at the right time can prevent a forced sale 5 years later. On an October evening in 2026, Travis finished a final pass on a field that had never carried a corridor, parked the old truck by the shed, and carried one ledger inside. The page he opened showed no dramatic line, just quiet totals. Acres owned, obligations current, reserves intact, loans helping others breathe, soil improving where it had been pressed too hard. Outside, the paint on the truck still flaked. Inside, the books still balanced. The man who had looked poorest in Putnam County had never been waiting for rescue. He had been building capacity, one restrained decision at a time, until he had enough to keep his neighbors in the game. He sat down, turned the ledger toward the lamp, and wrote the first line for the next review cycle, while the house settled around him. Verify outcomes, not intentions. Then he pulled the old taped folder from the lower drawer, the same one that had held the county hearing exhibits, and laid out each item in order on the table. 6 soil and yield reports, tile camera stills with date stamps, the bank letter showing $2,913,447.12 on hearing morning, carbon copies of the 4 cashier checks, signed covenant pages with each borrower's trigger terms. Nothing stayed symbolic in Travis's records for long. Every paper had to either produce a result or be marked abandoned, and none of these had been abandoned. 3 mornings later, he carried the folder into the Putnam County Extension Archive Room, where 2 staff members and the same lender analyst from the hearing were waiting beside a flatbed scanner. The analyst had come on his own time. He told Travis, without preface, that their AG desk had changed 2 underwriting forms because of this case, including 1 new required line, multi-year corridor loss adjustment, documented before long-term equipment financing. Travis nodded, handed over the reports, and asked that each file name include the field pass date, not just the farm name. By noon, the full packet was indexed in public records and cross-referenced in the Drainage Board compliance file. The numbers that had once lived in a shop notebook were now searchable county evidence. On the first Monday of December 2026, snow pushed sideways across the lot behind the Extension Office while the winter review room filled 1 chair at a time. Leon came in first with a yellow legal pad and a thermos. Brenda followed with a binder tabbed in red and blue. Darrell carried a banker box with invoices clipped by quarter. Wyatt arrived last, boots still muddy, and set down a laptop he had once said he would never use for accounting. 8 younger producers took the back row, the first full cohort funded or coached through the Fisher program. Travis did not stand at the front. He sat at the side table and asked Leon to open with hard numbers. Leon read them plainly. 2026 operated acres 420, Corn yield on remediated corridor-adjacent zones up 16 bushels from 2021 baseline and 9 bushels from 2024. Combine note retired in full. Refinance fixed at 4.9% on remaining term debt. Working capital ratio 1.46. Debt service coverage 1.31. Annual payment to the recovery pool made in September, $40,000 above minimum. He looked at Travis only once and said, "I kept the acres because you bought me time." Travis answered, "You kept the acres because you changed behavior." Brenda's turn was tighter, as always. She reported 310 core acres, no high rent bids above her ceiling, and a 2026 operating surplus of 101,200 after family draw. Emergency repairs, once 12 calls in a season, had fallen to 3. She had paid 31,000 back into her note and still increased her no-panic reserve to 171,400. Then she opened a second tab and read mentee outcomes for 2 younger operators she had coached. One cut projected machinery payments by $18,700 a year by buying auction equipment for $46,000 cash, instead of financing a $129,000 package. The other renegotiated rent on 140 acres and moved break-even down by 0.43 per bushel. She closed her binder and said the same line she had been repeating for 2 winters, now directed to the back row. Do not confuse acres with margin. By the second week of December, Darrell had become the case everyone watched for discipline under stress. He stood, unfolded one page, and read his debt schedule aloud. Old balance beside new balance, rate beside rate, no missing columns. Total obligations had dropped from $1.26 million, at peak to $742,000. Blended rate moved from 8.3% to 5.1%. Annual interest expense had fallen by $44,180 compared with the path he had been on before the hearing year. He had made his 3rd consecutive on-time payment into the pool, $52,000 this time. When he finished, he rested both hands on the table and said the sentence he had never finished on courthouse steps years earlier. Back then, I looked at that check and felt shame. The shame was not needing help. The shame was believing debt was the same as progress. Wyatt's report was shortest and maybe the most instructive. He projected his cash needs month by month on a whiteboard and showed where the old pattern used to break him. Peak draw season, once $620,000, now $438,000. Interest expense for 2026 closed at $28,700. 2 positive working capital years had become 3. Automatic surplus sweep to Travis's pool in November, $19,200. Then he pointed to one line item and laughed softly at himself. Late purchase fertilizer penalty, 0 for the first time in 6 seasons. He told the younger group, borrowed flexibility becomes borrowed panic if rates move faster than your plan. The multiplier that day was measurable and immediate. Across the original 4 recipients, cumulative repayments reached $458,350 by year-end 2026, leaving $321,650 outstanding, all current. Across 11 fund-supported beginner cases from the first cycle, average operating interest expense had dropped 24.1% against baseline plans, and 10 of 11 posted positive year-end working capital. Combined acres under improved drainage plans, including grant and self-funded match, reached 2,940. Estimated 5-year gross margin, preservation, and recovery attributable to the Travis Pool model and its required coaching discipline, updated with realized books through 2026, stood at $1,982,000. One restrained decision had turned into a framework. The framework had turned into a county habit. In January 2027, the Drainage Board reconvened for Prairie Meridian's remediation bond review. The room was smaller this time, less crowded, more technical. The clerk called exhibits by number. A through F were Travis's original reports, now accompanied by follow-up agronomy audits and tile camera reruns funded under the bond terms Derek once sought to reduce. 2 parcels had met restoration thresholds and received partial bond release. 2 had not, and full bond stayed in place pending additional work. No one argued from memory. Everyone argued from measured recovery and signed standards. Derek sat at council table in a compliance role, no longer the closer with the polished pitch. He had fewer lines and chose them carefully. When one new agent from his company suggested that the county benchmarks were excessive for future projects, Derek corrected him on the record. He said the benchmark was not punitive. It was the cost of quoting permanent rights with temporary assumptions in 2016. After adjournment, he crossed the hallway, stopped beside Travis, and handed him a printed training memo used for new right-of-way hires across 2 states. The first page title read, Long Horizon Agronomic Loss Modeling Minimum Protocol. The appendix cited Putnam County Exhibits A through F. Derek said, We use this before we quote now. Travis read the title, folded the memo once, and put it in the taped folder, where his original notes still lived. By early March, the roll call was no longer guesswork. Leon was still farming 420 acres and helping his daughter with books at night, teaching her to read debt service before she read yield brag sheets. Brenda was still on her 310-acre core, current on all obligations, and had been elected to the local cooperative board because she asked hard questions nobody else wanted to ask in public. Darrell was still farming a smaller footprint with cleaner ratios and had not missed a payment in 2 years. Wyatt was still debt discipline, off variable dependence, and had started requiring his own monthly stress tests before any input purchase over $10,000. Earl Whitcomb was still gone, but his $48,000 scholarship had already funded 6 repair track students at the vocational program, including one apprentice who rebuilt an older planter for a beginning farmer at 1/3 of dealer replacement cost. Travis was still in the same 2-bedroom farmhouse, still driving the 1998 Ford with rust through both rocker panels, now past 304,000 miles, heater fan still squealing on cold mornings. The patch coats remained on the same hooks by the door. The machinery line remained old and maintained, not pretty and financed. His land count remained 1,460 owned acres. His liquid reserves moved with disbursements and repayments, but by spring statements they remained above $3.6 million even after grants and operating cycles. The Fisher Soil and Debt-Free Transition Fund published its first full annual table exactly as promised. $412,000 awarded in Cycle 1, $389,000 in Cycle 2. All recipients listed with acreage, purpose, covenants, and current status. Transparent, verifiable, useful. On a clear April morning in 2027, Travis parked by the same machine shed, opened the tailgate, and loaded seed boxes for first pass. Leon pulled in behind him with a trailer hitch that had seen better paint. Brenda arrived with field maps rolled in a tube. Darrell came 5 minutes later with 2 younger producers from the winter cohort. Wyatt brought coffee and the latest repayment sheet. Nobody gave a speech. They checked rates, compared soil temperatures, and talked about timing rain that might miss them by 10 miles. Then Travis closed the tailgate, wiped his hands on a rag, and slid the taped folder behind the truck seat beside a fresh ledger. The county had finally learned what he had known since he was 12, and sitting beside his father after an auction sheet folded in silence. Wealth was not the check offered under pressure. Wealth was the ability to refuse the wrong money, survive the long math, and keep other people from being sold off when timing turned cruel. The truck looked poor in the morning light. The farm did not care what it looked like. The books were ready, the soil was draining, and the people who once thought he hated money were now farming because he had respected it.